The hospital
Take the
room
money.
smelled of
Sign
antiseptic
the
and fear.
papers. Hand me
Emily
my
had been
grandchild
awake
and
for
never
barely
come back.
3 hours since giving birth, and already the door had opened without a knock. 4 people walked in together, dressed in clothes that cost more than her entire apartment. At the front stood Margaret Whitfield, matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in the state, her expression as cold and composed as it had been the very first day Emily walked into that house, as hired help. Behind her stood 2 lawyers in dark suits, folders tucked under their arms, and a private investigator, whose face Emily recognized from months of quiet surveillance she had only half noticed at the time. Margaret did not ask how Emily was feeling. She did not glance at the newborn, wrapped in a hospital blanket beside her. She simply looked at Emily, the way she had looked at her from the beginning, as a problem to be managed, an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. And in that moment, exhausted, sore, and terrified, Emily understood that the real fight of her life was only just beginning. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from tonight. Some of you are winding down after a long shift. Some of you are listening on a drive home. And some of you are already invested in Emily's story before knowing a single detail about her past. Stay with us, because nothing in this house was ever what it appeared to be. And the woman standing at the foot of that hospital bed had spent nearly a year making sure of it. Emily's mother, whose own husband had left when Emily was only 4 years old, had built her entire adult life around the singular goal of making sure her daughter never felt the absence of security she herself had known. She worked 2 jobs through most of Emily's childhood, sacrificing sleep and health in equal measure. And though she rarely spoke about those years directly, Emily grew up understanding without being told exactly how much her mother had given up so that she could have a childhood relatively free of the hardship her mother carried silently. It was this history, more than any single conversation, that shaped Emily's own instinct to protect her daughter above every other consideration, regardless of what price that protection demanded. Emily was 26 years old when she first accepted the position at the Whitfield estate. She had grown up an hour outside the city, raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to keep food on the table. Emily had watched her mother come home exhausted more times than she could count, her hands cracked from cleaning solution, her back bent from carrying supplies up flights of stairs. Elevators were never installed for staff to use. She had promised herself as a teenager that she would find a way to give her mother a different kind of life, one where rest was not a luxury reserved for other people. When a staffing agency called with an opening at one of the largest private estates in the region, housekeeping with room and board included, Emily did not hesitate. The pay was modest by the family's standards, but more than double what she had been earning at a downtown diner. And the promise of stability, however conditional, felt like the first real opportunity she had been given in years. Emily's mother had cried the morning her daughter left for the estate, not from sadness, but from a complicated mixture of pride and worry that only a parent who had spent a lifetime protecting her child could understand. She reminded Emily that people with money did not always treat the people who worked for them with the respect they deserved, that she should keep her guard up and her expectations low, and that the moment anything felt wrong inside that house, she should not hesitate to come home. Emily promised she would, though privately she suspected her mother's warnings came from a place of fear rather than experience. Fear built from decades of being overlooked by employers who saw her only as a service rather than a person. The Whitfield estate stretched across nearly 40 acres, with a main house so large that Emily got lost twice during her first week. Margaret Whitfield ran the household with a precision that bordered on military discipline. Staff were expected to remain invisible, to speak only when spoken to, and to never, under any circumstance, form relationships with members of the family that extended beyond professional courtesy. Emily learned this rule within her first month, watching a fellow housekeeper dismissed without warning after Margaret discovered she had accepted a birthday gift from Richard Whitfield, the family patriarch, who had meant nothing more by it than simple kindness. The message was unmistakable. In this house, warmth toward staff was treated as a violation, and Margaret alone decided where the boundaries of that warmth began and ended. Richard Whitfield had built the family's fortune from a modest inheritance and a series of shrewd investments made decades earlier, long before Nathaniel was born, and his declining health in recent years had shifted more day-to-day authority onto Margaret's shoulders than either of them had originally intended. Those closest to the family sometimes noted that Margaret's rigid control over the household had grown sharper in direct proportion to Richard's weakening presence, as though she believed that maintaining absolute order in every visible detail of the estate could somehow compensate for the uncertainty neither of them spoke about directly, the uncertainty of how much longer Richard truly had left. The staff quarters sat in a separate wing of the estate, modest rooms that stood in stark contrast to the marble and gold leaf that filled the main house. Emily shared her early evenings with 3 other members of the household staff, women who had worked for the Whitfield family far longer than she had, and who quickly became an unofficial support system, warning her which hallways to avoid during Margaret's afternoon inspections, and which chores she should never leave incomplete, no matter how exhausted she felt by the end of a 16-hour day. It was from these women that Emily first heard whispered stories about the family's history, about Richard's declining health, about the quiet tension that seemed to run beneath every polished surface of the estate, tension none of the staff dared discuss above a whisper. Emily's daily routine during those first months followed a strict rhythm dictated entirely by Margaret's expectations. Mornings began before sunrise, polishing silver that would never be used, arranging flowers that would be replaced within days, ironing linens for guests who rarely acknowledged the staff who prepared their comfort. Emily did not resent the work itself. She had grown up understanding that labor, however invisible to those who benefited from it, deserved to be done well. What wore on her instead was the constant awareness that a single mistake, a chipped plate, a wrinkled napkin, could result in dismissal without warning, a lesson she had already watched happen to 2 other housekeepers within her first 3 months at the estate. The son, Nathaniel Whitfield, was 30 years old and expected to take over the family's investment empire the moment his father's health declined further. He had grown up with every advantage money could provide: private schools, international travel, a name that opened doors before he even finished introducing himself. And yet those who worked closely with him in those early days noticed something that set him apart from the rest of his family. Nathaniel treated the household staff as people rather than furniture. He learned names. He asked about weekends. He remembered small details: a daughter's school recital, a mother's surgery, details Margaret would have considered irrelevant to the smooth operation of her household. Emily noticed this quality in him before she noticed anything else, long before either of them understood where it would eventually lead. Nathaniel's childhood, though outwardly privileged in every measurable way, had been shaped by a persistent loneliness few outside the estate ever recognized. Boarding schools filled his adolescence with structure rather than warmth, and holidays at home were often consumed by his parents' business obligations rather than the kind of ordinary family time he sometimes glimpsed in the households of friends whose families had far less money but noticeably more laughter. By the time he reached adulthood, Nathaniel had grown skilled at appearing content in rooms that never quite felt like they belonged to him, a skill that made his late-night conversations with Emily feel less like a betrayal of his responsibilities and more like the first genuinely honest connection he had experienced in years. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident, on a rainy evening when Emily was sent to deliver a stack of folded linens to the study where Nathaniel worked late most nights. She found him staring at a spreadsheet with an expression of such quiet exhaustion that she asked, without thinking, whether he had eaten anything since breakfast. He admitted he had not. What followed was not romantic, not yet, simply 2 people sharing a plate of reheated food in a room meant for business rather than conversation, talking about nothing important: work schedules, the shifting weather, the strange quiet of a house that large after midnight. Emily left that evening thinking nothing more of it than a pleasant break from routine, unaware that Nathaniel had thought of little else for the rest of the week. By the summer, Nathaniel and Emily were meeting in secret whenever his schedule allowed, careful never to be seen together by the rest of the staff, or, more importantly, by Margaret. Nathaniel began speaking about a future neither of them had any right to imagine, a life away from the estate, away from the expectations that had shaped every decision of his life since childhood. Emily tried to remain practical. She reminded him that people like her did not end up with people like him, that Margaret would never allow it, that the fantasy he described existed only in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the rest of the house was asleep, and consequences felt distant. But Nathaniel was persistent in a way that slowly wore down her caution. And by the time autumn arrived, Emily had allowed herself to believe, if only in private, that perhaps this time would be different. Richard Whitfield, though weakened by years of declining health, remained sharper than his wife often gave him credit for. On more than one occasion that summer, he caught his son lingering near the staff kitchen at hours that had no business reason behind them, and though he said nothing directly, he began watching the two of them with a quiet attentiveness Margaret never noticed. Richard had married into money himself decades earlier, a fact the family rarely discussed, and he harbored a private sympathy for anyone navigating the same unspoken hierarchy he had once been forced to prove himself against. He kept his observations to himself that season, uncertain yet of what he was truly witnessing, but he did not forget them. One evening in early September, a single member of the household staff, a longtime groundskeeper named Walter, saw them together on the property's east trail, walking closer than any employer and employee ever should. Walter said nothing that night. He had worked for the Whitfield family for over 20 years, long enough to have watched Margaret dismiss staff for far smaller offenses, and long enough to understand that whatever was happening between Nathaniel and Emily was not his business to report. He kept the secret not out of loyalty to either of them specifically, but out of a quiet belief that some things deserved privacy, even inside a house where privacy was treated as a rumor rather than a right. By October, Emily discovered she was pregnant. She told Nathaniel first, in the same kitchen where their conversations had begun a year earlier. He did not panic. He did not distance himself. Instead, he held her hands and told her this was the moment he had been waiting for, an excuse to finally stop hiding, to finally tell his parents the truth about the life he wanted to build. Emily wanted to believe him completely, but some quiet, cautious part of her, shaped by a childhood watching her mother be underestimated and dismissed by people with more money and more power, warned her that hope in that house had a way of being punished before it was ever allowed to bloom. Nathaniel spent the following days quietly preparing for the conversation he intended to have with his parents, drafting explanations in his head, rehearsing responses to every objection he imagined his mother might raise. He told Emily he wanted to speak with his father first, believing Richard would be more receptive to the news and could help soften Margaret's reaction once the truth came out. He had no way of knowing that his mother would learn everything before he ever had the chance to control how or when the truth was revealed, and that every carefully rehearsed explanation he had prepared would count for nothing once Margaret decided how the situation would be handled. Before Nathaniel could arrange the conversation with his parents, Margaret Whitfield discovered the truth on her own. A member of the medical staff caring for Richard had noticed Emily's condition during a routine estate physical required of all live-in employees, and word reached Margaret within days. She did not confront Emily directly at first. Instead, she began quietly rearranging the pieces of her son's life with the same cold efficiency she brought to every decision inside that house, determined that whatever accident had occurred between her son and the household help would be corrected before it could threaten the family's carefully maintained image. Margaret's first call was to the head of the family's investment firm, a longtime associate who owed the Whitfield name more favors than he could ever repay. She described a fabricated emergency overseas, a merger negotiation that supposedly required Nathaniel's immediate and prolonged presence, and asked him to draft the paperwork that would make the story appear legitimate to anyone who asked, including Nathaniel himself. The associate did not question her. In a family like the Whitfields, questioning Margaret's decisions was not something anyone in her circle had learned to do, and the machinery of the fabricated crisis was set into motion within a single afternoon. Within a week, Nathaniel was informed of an urgent business matter requiring his immediate presence overseas, a merger negotiation Margaret insisted only he could handle personally. He resisted at first, telling his mother the timing was impossible, that there were things at home he could not leave unresolved. Margaret assured him the matter would only take a few weeks, that the family's financial future depended on his presence at the negotiating table, and that Emily, whatever arrangement he believed existed between them, would still be there when he returned. Nathaniel, trusting his mother in a way he would later regret bitterly, boarded a plane 3 days later, unaware that Margaret had no intention of allowing that reunion to ever take place. Overseas, Nathaniel found the negotiation itself oddly hollow, meetings that seemed to accomplish little of substance despite Margaret's insistence on their urgency. Associates, who seemed vaguely surprised each time he pressed for a firm timeline on when the deal might actually close. He called home nightly during the first 2 weeks, growing increasingly frustrated when Emily failed to answer, telling himself each time that she was simply busy, that the distance between them was temporary, that whatever silence had crept into their communication was a misunderstanding rather than something deliberately engineered against him. The days stretched into weeks. Emily tried reaching Nathaniel repeatedly, but her calls went unanswered, her messages seemingly undelivered. What she did not know was that Margaret had quietly arranged for Nathaniel's phone to be replaced under the pretense of a security upgrade required for international travel, a device that filtered and blocked any communication from numbers not pre-approved by the family's security team. Emily's name, quietly and deliberately, had never made that approved list. Margaret visited Emily personally during the second week of Nathaniel's absence, arriving at the staff quarters unannounced and dismissing the other housekeepers from the room with a single glance. She informed Emily, in the same measured tone she used to discuss household budgets, that Nathaniel's sudden trip had given the family time to consider their options carefully, and that those options did not include a future involving household staff and unplanned pregnancies. She suggested, without ever raising her voice, that Emily consider what kind of life she truly wanted to give her child, one built on false promises inside a family that would never fully accept her, or one built on financial independence and a fresh start, far away from complications that could only end badly. Emily refused to believe it at first, but the isolation, the unanswered calls, and Margaret's calm certainty began wearing away at her confidence. Margaret offered her a settlement, a significant sum of money, in exchange for her immediate resignation and silence about the relationship entirely. Emily refused twice, insisting she did not want money. She wanted the truth about why Nathaniel had suddenly gone silent. Margaret's response was patient and merciless in equal measure. She reminded Emily that she had no family connections, no legal standing, and no way to prove that anything beyond an employment relationship had ever existed between her and Nathaniel, should the matter ever be examined by anyone outside the estate's walls. By the third week, Margaret's approach shifted from persuasion to something closer to quiet intimidation. She reminded Emily that a young woman with no savings, no family influence, and a newborn on the way would find it extraordinarily difficult to secure future employment if word spread that she had attempted to manipulate her way into a wealthy family through a fabricated relationship with their son. The threat was never explicit enough to be recorded or repeated with confidence, but its meaning was unmistakable, and Emily, alone and increasingly desperate, began to understand that she was fighting a battle against resources and influence she had no way of matching. Emily left the Whitfield estate 2 weeks later, taking only what fit into the same suitcase she had arrived with a year earlier. She moved back in with her mother temporarily, then eventually found a small apartment across the city, far enough from the estate that she hoped the Whitfield family would forget she had ever existed. She carried the pregnancy alone through the winter, working double shifts at a diner not unlike the one she had left behind, telling herself that whatever happened next, her child would grow up knowing a mother who fought for her, even when fighting felt impossible. Alone in her small rented room that winter, Emily often replayed the final weeks at the estate, searching for some detail she might have missed, some sign that would have warned her Margaret already knew everything long before the confrontation ever happened. She wondered whether Nathaniel had truly been deceived by his mother's fabricated emergency, or whether some part of him had simply found it easier to comply with expectation rather than fight for what they had built together. These doubts never fully resolved themselves during those isolated months, and Emily forced herself instead to focus on the more immediate demands of survival: rent due at the end of each month, prenatal appointments squeezed between diner shifts, a due date approaching faster than her savings could keep pace with. Emily's mother welcomed her home without a single word of blame, though the worry Emily remembered from the morning she first left for the estate had clearly deepened into something heavier. She helped Emily prepare a small nursery corner in the cramped apartment they eventually shared, insisting that whatever the Whitfield family believed about people like them, no child born into that much love would ever go without. The two women spent that winter rebuilding a life neither of them had planned. One shift, one bill, one quiet evening at a time. And if Emily ever doubted her decision to leave the estate, rather than accept Margaret's settlement, her mother's steady presence reminded her why the decision had never truly been a difficult one. The diner where Emily found work that winter was nothing like the estate, loud and cramped and smelling permanently of fryer oil. But the manager did not ask questions about her past and paid her fairly for the hours she worked. Regular customers began to notice her growing belly and, unlike Margaret, most treated her with a kind of unspoken solidarity. An older waitress named Doris, quietly slipping her extra tips on the hardest days. Another customer offering the name of a doctor who charged reduced rates for expectant mothers without insurance. Emily never told any of them the full story of who the father was. She simply let them believe, as most single expectant mothers were assumed to be, that she was managing alone by circumstance rather than by another family's deliberate design. What Emily did not know was that Nathaniel had spent those same weeks growing increasingly desperate overseas, confused by her sudden silence and suspicious of his own family's insistence that the negotiation required his continued presence far longer than any merger reasonably should. When he finally returned home in late November, he went immediately to find Emily, only to discover she no longer worked at the estate, and no one on staff would tell him where she had gone. His mother offered a story about Emily quitting suddenly to pursue an opportunity elsewhere, a story Nathaniel found impossible to believe, given everything they had built together in the months before his departure. Nathaniel confronted his mother directly within days of his return, demanding to know why Emily's departure felt so abrupt, why none of the staff seemed willing to discuss it directly, and why his own phone had behaved so strangely throughout the entire negotiation trip. Margaret deflected every question with practiced calm, insisting he was imagining conspiracies where none existed, that grief over a failed workplace romance was clouding his judgment, and that the healthiest thing he could do was focus on the responsibilities awaiting him within the family business, rather than chasing after a woman who had clearly moved on with her life. Nathaniel did not fully believe her, but without any way to reach Emily, he had little choice but to begin searching quietly on his own. He reached out to former staff members, careful not to alert his mother to his suspicions. It was Walter, the longtime groundskeeper who had kept their secret months earlier, who finally broke his silence, telling Nathaniel gently but honestly that Emily had left in tears, that something had clearly happened between her and Margaret before her departure, and that if Nathaniel truly cared for her, he needed to look harder than his mother's version of events allowed. Walter had joined the Whitfield estate as a young groundskeeper decades earlier, back when Richard himself still walked the property daily, inspecting the orchard he had planted with his own hands, before his health made such walks impossible. Over the years, Walter had quietly witnessed the family's private moments in ways none of the household staff who worked indoors ever could. Arguments carried out on garden paths that no one realized carried across open air. Tears shed on benches meant for quiet reflection rather than witness. He had learned long ago that survival in that household depended on knowing exactly which secrets were his to keep and which, eventually, needed to reach the right person at the right time. Armed with Walter's information, Nathaniel began his own search, contacting old friends, hospitals, and anyone who might know where Emily had gone. Weeks passed without success, until a former co-worker from the diner mentioned Emily had recently been admitted to a hospital downtown, closer to her due date than Nathaniel had realized. He arrived at the hospital not knowing what he would find, only that he could not let another day pass without knowing the truth about the child he now suspected might be his own, and about the woman who had disappeared so completely from his life. The nurses who attended Emily throughout that long night later remarked, in the quiet way hospital staff often do, that she had labored with a kind of determined silence, that seemed to surprise even the most experienced among them, gripping the bed rail through each contraction without complaint, as though she had already decided, somewhere deep within herself, that whatever came next, she would face it with the same steady resolve her mother had modeled for her throughout childhood. When her daughter was finally placed against her chest just after dawn, Emily later said she felt, for the first time in months, a fleeting sense that everything that had happened to bring her to that moment might somehow have been worth enduring. The labor itself had been long and difficult, stretching through most of the previous night before Emily finally delivered a healthy daughter just after dawn. Exhausted beyond anything she had experienced in her life, Emily spent those first quiet hours simply staring at her daughter's face, memorizing every detail, trying to hold on to a moment of peace she suspected would not last long once the Whitfield family learned where she was. She was right to suspect it. Margaret's private investigator had been tracking her location for weeks, waiting only for the birth itself before making his final report. Margaret arrived first, accompanied by 2 family lawyers and a private investigator carrying documents prepared weeks in advance. She walked into Emily's hospital room within hours of the birth, before Emily had even fully recovered from labor, and placed a stack of legal papers on the blanket beside her exhausted daughter. Margaret's opening words were simple and devastating in their bluntness. "Give us the baby and leave," she explained, in the same calm, businesslike tone she used to negotiate contracts, that the family was prepared to offer a generous financial settlement in exchange for full custody, a settlement large enough to secure Emily's future for decades, provided she signed away all parental rights immediately and left quietly, without ever contacting Nathaniel or the family again. Margaret had rehearsed this exact conversation dozens of times in the weeks leading up to the birth, running through every possible objection Emily might raise and preparing a calm, reasonable response for each one. She had convinced herself, through months of careful rationalization, that she was not doing anything cruel, simply protecting a family legacy from a complication that threatened decades of careful planning. It did not occur to her, or perhaps she refused to let it occur to her, that the child sleeping in Emily's arms represented not a complication to be managed, but a person who would one day grow old enough to hear the full story of how her own grandmother had once tried to take her away. The lawyers standing behind Margaret began laying out the settlement terms in clinical detail, numbers that would have changed Emily's entire life just months earlier, an amount large enough to buy a house outright, to never work another double shift, to give her mother the retirement she had never been able to afford. For a brief, disorienting moment, Emily felt the weight of exhaustion and fear pulling her toward simply signing whatever was placed in front of her, if only to make the room stop feeling like it was closing in around her. But then she looked down at her daughter's face, still red and unfamiliar from birth, and something in her steadied. Emily looked down at her daughter, then back at the woman who had once dismissed her as nothing more than temporary household help, and felt something inside her steady rather than break. She thought of her own mother, who had raised her alone with nothing but determination and love. And she thought of every night she had watched that same mother refuse to be diminished by people who believed money made them superior. Emily met Margaret's eyes directly for the first time since walking into that house years earlier, and told her, in a voice steadier than she believed herself capable of in that moment, that no amount of money would ever be enough to buy her daughter. Margaret's expression hardened, and she began explaining the legal avenues available to the family, the resources they could bring against a single mother with no support and no financial security of her own. She spoke of custody battles that could stretch on for years, legal fees Emily could never hope to match, and a legal system that history had shown consistently favored families with resources over families without. She reminded Emily, almost gently, that fighting a family like the Whitfields rarely ended well for the people without a name behind them, and that refusing the settlement offered today would not make a future offer more generous. Before she could finish outlining every advantage her lawyers had already prepared, the hospital room door opened again, and Nathaniel walked in, breathing hard, as though he had run the entire length of the hospital corridor to reach that room in time. He took in the scene immediately, his mother standing over Emily's hospital bed with lawyers and legal documents, and something in his expression shifted from confusion to a controlled, quiet fury Emily had never seen from him before. not even during the most stressful moments of hiding their relationship over the past year. Margaret attempted to justify her actions as protecting the family's reputation and future, but Nathaniel cut her off, reminding her that she had lied to his face for months, intercepted his communications, and pressured a woman who had just given birth into signing away her own daughter. He turned to Emily first, his voice softening as he apologized for every week of silence he now understood had never been his choice, and then turned back to his mother, his expression harder than Emily had ever seen it, informing her that whatever consequences followed from what he was about to do, he no longer cared how it reflected on the family name. Margaret, unaccustomed to her son speaking to her with anything other than deference, attempted to regain control of the conversation, reminding Nathaniel of everything the family had built, everything he stood to inherit, everything that could be lost if he chose a household employee and an unplanned child over the responsibilities he had been raised to fulfill. Nathaniel's response was immediate and unwavering. He told his mother that he had spent 30 years believing the family name was worth protecting above all else, and that watching what she had done over the past several months had shown him exactly how little that name was actually worth. Just as the room seemed to settle into an uneasy standoff between mother and son, the family's longtime estate attorney arrived, having been urgently contacted by Walter the moment he learned where the confrontation was unfolding. The attorney carried a sealed envelope, documents belonging to Richard Whitfield himself, drafted months earlier, during a period when his health had briefly declined and he had quietly revised his will without Margaret's knowledge. The documents contained a clause specifically protecting any grandchild born to Nathaniel, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, guaranteeing that child a portion of the family's holdings that no one, not even Margaret, could legally revoke. The attorney explained, with careful professional neutrality, that Richard had grown suspicious of the sudden overseas negotiation months earlier and had privately requested this addendum to the family trust as a precaution, uncertain exactly what his wife was planning, but certain enough that something was being hidden from him. Richard, it turned out, had watched his son and Emily far more closely than either of them realized during that final summer at the estate, and had drawn his own conclusions long before any official confirmation reached him. The room fell silent as the full weight of the clause settled over everyone present. Margaret had spent months orchestrating Emily's isolation, intercepting her son's communications, and now stood on the verge of losing everything she had spent her life protecting, precisely because of the lengths she had gone to in trying to erase Emily and the child from the family's story entirely. Richard, it turned out, had suspected something was happening between his son and the young housekeeper long before Margaret discovered the pregnancy, and had taken quiet steps to ensure that whatever choices his wife made in his absence could not undo what mattered most to him, the protection of his family's next generation, whoever that generation's mother happened to be. Margaret had not always been the woman standing in that hospital room. Decades earlier, before she married into the Whitfield name, she had been a young woman from a modest background herself, a fact she had spent 30 years working to erase from any conversation about her identity. Those who had known her before her marriage sometimes whispered that her harshness toward household staff came from an old, buried discomfort with her own origins, a fear that any softness shown toward people who reminded her of who she once was might somehow expose the distance she had worked so hard to build between her past and her present. Margaret sat down slowly in the chair beside the hospital bed, the composure she had maintained since walking into the room finally beginning to crack. She had spent her entire adult life believing that careful planning and enough resources could shape any outcome she desired, and the discovery that her own husband had quietly worked around her, protecting the very child she had come to erase, seemed to strip away every certainty she had built her identity around. For the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, Margaret Whitfield had no immediate response prepared. Nathaniel turned to Emily, taking her hand gently, and told her that none of the money or the family name mattered to him if it meant losing her and their daughter. He said he was prepared to walk away from the inheritance entirely, to build a life with her on terms that had nothing to do with his mother's approval or the estate's expectations. Emily, still holding their daughter against her chest, felt the exhaustion of the past months finally begin to loosen its grip. replaced by something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time: the quiet, steady relief of no longer having to fight entirely alone. Emily, watching the exchange between mother and son unfold in front of her, found herself unexpectedly steady despite everything her body had endured over the past 12 hours. She had spent months imagining this confrontation in one form or another, rehearsing what she might say if she ever found herself face to face with Margaret again. And yet now that the moment had actually arrived, she realized the only thing she truly needed to say had already been said the moment she refused the settlement. Everything else, she understood, was simply Nathaniel and his mother working through a reckoning that had been decades in the making. One that had very little to do with her directly, and everything to do with the kind of family Nathaniel had decided he wanted to build going forward. The lawyers Margaret had brought quietly gathered their documents and excused themselves from the room, recognizing that whatever leverage the family had believed they held over Emily had evaporated the moment Richard's protective clause entered the conversation. Margaret remained seated, staring at her granddaughter for the first time since entering the room, an expression on her face that Emily could not quite read, something between grief and the slow, uncomfortable beginning of reconsideration. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel formally stepped back from his position within the family's investment company, choosing instead to build something independent, away from Margaret's influence entirely. He spent every day proving to Emily, through consistent presence rather than promises, that the man who had disappeared during those difficult months had never truly been him, but rather the version of him his mother had manipulated from thousands of miles away. Margaret, faced with the reality of the protective clause in Richard's will and the very public unraveling of her carefully maintained control over the family's affairs, found herself with far less power than she had wielded just weeks earlier, and far fewer allies willing to defend her decisions once the full story became known among the small circle of people who mattered to the family's reputation. Richard, weakened but lucid, spoke privately with Emily during her first visit back to the estate, an encounter Emily had not expected and had approached with considerable apprehension. He told her simply that he had watched his son change over the course of the previous year, watched him become more thoughtful, more present, more himself, and that he understood exactly what kind of person was responsible for that change, long before anyone confirmed it to him directly. He apologized on behalf of a family that had made her feel disposable, and asked only that she allow his granddaughter the chance to know him in whatever time he had remaining. Richard's health continued its slow decline over the following 2 years, but those close to the family often said the final chapter of his life was markedly gentler than the years preceding it, spent surrounded by a granddaughter who visited often and a son who no longer carried the weight of expectations Richard himself had never truly wanted to place on him in the first place. Richard told Nathaniel once, during one of their final conversations, that watching him build something honest and independent had given him more pride than watching him simply inherit what previous generations had already built, a sentiment Nathaniel carried with him long after his father was gone. Walter, the groundskeeper who had quietly protected their secret and eventually helped reunite them, was offered a permanent position overseeing the property Nathaniel purchased for his new life with Emily, a small estate far removed from the Whitfield name and its expectations. Emily's mother, who had spent decades cleaning other people's homes to support her daughter, was finally given the rest she had earned, moving into a guest cottage on the same property where she could watch her granddaughter grow up surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could offer them. It was, Emily often said in later years, the first time in her family's history that kindness had been rewarded rather than quietly taken advantage of. Doris and the other regulars at the diner never learned the full ending of Emily's story, though a few of them read about the Whitfield family's quiet reorganization in local business coverage months later, and wondered privately whether the young pregnant waitress they had once looked out after had any connection to it. Emily never confirmed it to any of them, preferring to let that chapter of her life remain separate from the friendships that had carried her through the hardest winter of her life. Friendships built on nothing more than shared humanity, rather than any expectation of what she might someday become. Margaret's relationship with Nathaniel took years to rebuild, and even then, it never fully returned to what it had once been. She attended her granddaughter's early birthdays cautiously, watching from the edges of gatherings she no longer felt entitled to lead, slowly learning what it meant to be present in a family without controlling every detail of it. Emily, for her part, never demanded an apology from Margaret that could undo the months of isolation and manipulation she had endured, choosing instead to focus her energy on the life she was building with Nathaniel, a decision that ultimately gave her more peace than any confrontation ever could have. Some who had known Nathaniel only through the family's public reputation before that year found the man he became afterward almost unrecognizable, quieter in his ambitions, but far steadier in his convictions, more interested in building something that reflected his own values than in proving himself worthy of a name he ultimately chose to step away from. Those who worked alongside him in his new venture often said he spoke of Emily and their daughter not as a footnote to his professional success, but as the entire reason any of it mattered to him at all. A rare kind of honesty in a world that had once trained him to keep his private life carefully separated from everything else. Nathaniel's independent venture, built from nothing over the first 2 years after leaving the family company, grew slowly but steadily, driven by the same instincts for genuine connection that had first drawn Emily to him in the estate kitchen years earlier. He hired people the way he had once treated the household staff, as individuals with lives and needs beyond their job titles, and many who worked for him in those early years often remarked that the company felt less like an inheritance rebuilt and more like an entirely new identity he had chosen deliberately for himself. Their daughter's early years were marked by an ordinary happiness that neither Emily nor Nathaniel took for granted, precisely because both of them understood how easily it could have been taken from them. Birthdays were celebrated without the rigid formality Nathaniel remembered from his own childhood, and holidays were spent with Emily's mother at the center of the table rather than relegated to a separate staff dining area, a detail that meant more to Emily than any amount of the settlement money she had once been offered and refused. Years later, those who visited Nathaniel and Emily's home described a life built quietly and deliberately, far removed from the world of board meetings and inherited obligations Nathaniel had once been destined for. Their daughter grew up knowing the full story of how her parents met, not as a fairy tale scrubbed clean of its difficult chapters, but as an honest account of two people who had been tested by forces far more powerful than either of them, and who had chosen each other anyway, even when choosing each other cost more than either had ever anticipated paying. Their daughter, in later years, would sometimes ask her mother whether she had ever been afraid during those months alone, and Emily always answered honestly, telling her that fear had been a constant companion throughout that entire winter, but that fear alone had never once been strong enough to make her consider giving up her daughter for any amount of money. She wanted her daughter to grow up understanding that courage was rarely the absence of fear, but rather the decision to keep moving forward despite it. A lesson she hoped would serve her daughter well long after Emily herself was no longer there to remind her of it. Some people believe that money can solve every problem placed in front of it, but the one thing it has never been able to purchase is a mother's love, or the quiet courage it takes to protect what matters most when everything else is offered in exchange. When the Whitfield family asked Emily to choose between a fortune and her daughter, they underestimated the one thing money could never account for in their calculations: a woman who had watched her own mother refuse to be broken, and who had learned from that example long before she ever set foot inside their house. If you were in Emily's position, would you have taken the money and walked away, or would you have fought to keep your daughter regardless of the cost? Let us know in the comments below, and stay with us, because our next story is even more difficult to look away from.